Thank you for joining us as we take a look at Unit 2, Population and Migration. You should be familiar with the phrase demographics, which is the study of human population distribution and migration. Population distributions are descriptions of where on the Earth's surface individuals live. If you take a look at this diagram, you'll discover that of the world's population, more than 1 in 3 are either from China or from India. The ecumene is the portion of the Earth's surface occupied by permanent human settlement. There are some places in the world where people just can't live because of the environment. Think of Antarctica or the midst of the Sahara Desert. So the ecumene portion is where people actually live in permanent settlements. Some common traits of the ecumene include, because most of the land masses are north of the equator, nearly 90% of all people live north of the equator. And we discovered in class by doing our maps that most people live close to sea level, and about 2/3 of the world's population is concentrated within 300 miles of the ocean. One way in which you measure population is by looking at population density. This is the number of people occupying a particular area of land. You measure population density in one of 3 ways: arithmetic density, physiological density, and agricultural density. Now, we covered all 3 of these in our Unit 1 review, so I'm not going to repeat that again here. 2/3 of the world's population is concentrated in 4 specific regions. We'll go through those in just a minute. This particular map is known as a cartogram, and in the map you see the size of the countries are distorted based on their population. So China and India are huge, and Canada and Russia are tiny. Again, size of the country depiction is based on population. The first of those 4 areas is East Asia, and this includes China, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula. The second of the areas is South Asia, and this includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. The third area, Southeast Asia, which includes Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Java, Sumatra. And the fourth is Europe, which is a bit different in that its populations are largely concentrated in urban areas. Europe being mostly developed compared to a lot of the less developed countries we saw in the other areas. 3 tools we use to measure population change are the crude birth rate, the crude death rate, and the natural increase rate. Crude birth rate, total number of live births every year for each 1,000 people alive in the society. Similarly, the crude death rate is the total number of deaths in a year for every 1,000 people alive in the society. The natural increase rate is the percentage by which a population grows in a year, and the natural increase rate is calculated by subtracting the death rate from the birth rate. If it's a positive number, your population is growing. If you have a negative number, your population is shrinking. The doubling rate is the amount of time it takes to double a population, to go, for example, from 1 billion to 2 billion. Now, there's a tie-in with the natural increase rate. If there is a change to the natural increase rate, for example, if the natural increase rate decreases, meaning less children are born per year, then the doubling rate will go up. It will take longer to double the population. The population pyramid is a graphic illustration that can show us the distribution of age groups within a country's population, as well as the sex ratio, which is the ratio of males to females, and the dependency ratio, which is the number of people who are either too old to work or too young to work, and as a result are dependent upon those who are able to work. This is an example of a population pyramid. In this case, it is Kenya's, and it's a bar graph, and broken into male and females, males on the left, females on the right, and broken by age group. Each of these 5-year age groups are known as cohorts. This graphic does a good job of explaining how to interpret a population pyramid. It would probably be worth your while to pause the video for a minute as you read and digest the information on how to interpret a population pyramid. For poorer countries, their population pyramids look like actual pyramids, with a broad base indicating high number of children, and life expectancy is generally shorter. For wealthier countries, the chart is shaped more like a lopsided vase, with a more narrow base than the pyramid of the poorer countries, where we see decreasing birth rates, and we'll also see an aging population, with more of the population being here on the top. Now we'll take a look at everybody's favorite, the demographic transition model. This explains the transition from high birth and death rates in a country to low birth and death rates as that country shifts from being a pre-industrial to a post-industrial economic system. The 3 major components of the demographic transition model are the birth rate, the death rate, and then the result of those two being the total population. In stage 1 of the demographic transition model, people are essentially hunter and gatherers, and the natural increase rate is essentially 0. You have a high birth rate and a high death rate that fluctuates given on things like famines or droughts. And the result is a low population and very small population growth. You should remember that there is no country in the world today that is still in stage 1 of the demographic transition. Stage 2 of the demographic transition model is brought about by both the agricultural and industrial revolutions. The result of this is birth rates that remain high and a death rate that plummets. People are living more because of improved nutrition and some improvements in medicine. And the result of that high birth rate and plummeting death rate is the fastest population growth rate of any of these. In stage 3 of the demographic transition model, we see changes brought about by culture. Essentially, as people are transitioning from primary sector to more industrial, they realize they don't need 7 children. So you start seeing birth rates dropping, death rates continue to drop a bit, and while the population is still increasing, it's not increasing as rapidly as it did in stage 2. In stage 4 of the demographic transition model, we have declining growth as birth rates continue to drop to the point where they are essentially equal to the death rate, and you have 0 population growth. Now, stage 5 of the demographic transition model isn't officially part of it, but it has been proposed by a number of people. In stage 5, we continue to see birth rates dropping till you get to the point where it is actually lower than the death rate, and as a result, you have negative population growth. And you see this in countries such as Japan, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Denmark. The epidemiologic transition model focuses on distinctive causes of death in each stage of the demographic transition. Essentially, in the early stages, infectious diseases have the higher rates of death. As we move into stage 3, infectious diseases are less of an impact, and we start seeing the growth of non-communicable diseases such as cancer, heart disease. Basically, before stage 3, life expectancy was too low for aging diseases like heart disease and cancer to be significant causes of death. And here we see the various diseases that go with each of the 5 stages. Now let's take a look at Thomas Malthus. Malthus was an Englishman who in the early 1800s proposed that because the population increased geometrically and food supply increased linearly, that there would come a point where the population would exceed the ability of the food supply to support it. And at this point, you would have what's called a Malthusian catastrophe, and famine and disease would keep the population from continuing to rise. Malthus's theory did not come to realization because the world's food supply did indeed increase faster than the population growth. Malthus still has his supporters today, known as Neo-Malthusians, who believe that the growth of less developed countries is outstripping Malthus's predictions of the population. And not only is the population increasing, but in addition to food, we're also putting pressure on other resources such as fresh water. Carrying capacity is the maximum population that an environment can sustain in a particular place, given the habitat and food and water that are available. Until you exceed that carrying capacity, that environment is not overpopulated. Generally, in the world today, birth rates are declining and the natural increase rate is dropping. The decrease in the total fertility rates and natural increase rates are for a number of reasons, one of which is the percentage of women using modern contraceptive methods. And in places where those numbers are low, like here in sub-Saharan Africa, it is often a combination of religion and cultural tradition that resists modern-day contraceptive methods. Another thing influencing the decline in birth rates is education level. As more women around the world are educated, we see a drop in the number of children per family. Governments have population policies dealing with the size of their population. The 2 types of policies are expansive population policies, where the government is seeking to increase the rate of natural increase, and restrictive population policies, where they're seeking to reduce the rate of natural increase. Our example for expansive population policies were Russia, Denmark, what we talked about in class, and restrictive population policies were China and India. You may remember that China's one-child policy created a generation where boys outnumbered girls, and projected by 2020 there would be 30 million unmarried men. So you see here the yellow is the initial 2005 population pyramid, and this is the projected 2050. And you see a significant aging of the population. By 2050, about 30% of the population will be over the age of 60. And because there's no pensions or social securities, 3 out of 10 families will have grandparents living with them. And for our one-child families, they could look forward to supporting both parents and possibly up to 4 grandparents. Should be an interesting 30 years. Now let's take a look at migration, which looks at the movement of people. We discussed that there are 3 types of movement. Cyclical movement is a movement, there and back kind of movement that occurs on a regular basis. You're coming to school every day, my going to work every day are all examples of cyclical movement. Periodic movement involves a longer period of time away from home. If you're a military family going off on deployment for 6 months, would be a periodic movement. If you have a college student in the family where they go off for 3 months and then come back, again, periodic movement. It's a regular movement here and there, but longer periods of time. The one we're really interested in today is migration, which is a permanent relocation. I'm not just going there for vacation or work, I am moving there permanently. And again, the migration is a permanent move to a new location. You should be comfortable with these terms. Emigration with an E is migration from a location. Immigration with an I is migration to a location. So when I moved from Germany to the United States, I was an emigrant with an E from Germany and an immigrant with an I in the United States. The way I remember the difference is E for exit and I for in. The difference between those numbers in any given year is known as net migration. A forced migration occurs when someone is involuntarily caused to migrate. And examples of that would be Atlantic slave trade, Britain relocating prisoners to Australia, the U.S. relocating Native Americans. You may remember from 6th grade history, the Trail of Tears. A refugee is a person that leaves their home because they're forced out, not because they're officially relocated or enslaved, but forced out by circumstances. The way I remember refugees are given the choice, they would remain or would return to their original home. Voluntary migration, as the name implies, is not forced, but is undertaken voluntarily by the person moving. You should clearly remember that most people move for economic reasons. There are other reasons as well, but the biggest one is people voluntarily migrate for economic reasons, in search of work or better work. We briefly looked at Ravenstein's 11 laws on migration, but we didn't spend a lot of time because some of these seem to be quite common sense. Ravenstein's laws include ideas such as majority of migrants move a short distance. If you're going to move a longer distance, you're probably going to choose a larger city as your destination. Urban residents are less migratory than those in rural areas, which again is common sense because there's going to be more job opportunities in an urban area than there is in a rural area. And remember, most voluntary moves are economic. International migration is a permanent move from one country to another, whereas internal migration is a permanent move within the same country. And internal migration is way more common than international. Interregional migration is movement from one region of that country to another, while intra, with an A, is migration within that region. So if I move from here to Los Angeles, that would be an interregional move. If I move from here to Richmond, which is also in Virginia, would be an intra-regional move. Two ideas within migration are step migration and chain migration. Step migration is the idea that often long-distance migration does not occur in one event, but occurs in smaller moves or smaller stages. Chain migration occurs when one person or group follows another group to a new location. You may follow a family member or someone else from your town or village. When it comes to migration, you may remember that there are both push and pull factors. Push factors are those factors which cause you to leave. They're pushing you out of the area. Pull factors are those factors that cause you to be drawn towards that area, so they're pulling you in. They're attracting you. So some of the push factors include environmental, economic, political, poverty, disaster, while pull factors include economic opportunity, political stability, etc.